Prince Harry kicked off Howard Stern's show after brutal clash. He walked into the wrong studio, thinking his title would protect him. For over 4 decades, Howard Stern has been the undisputed king of brutally honest interviews. A man who asks what no one else dares, who pushes where no one else will, who sees through every carefully constructed narrative and dissects it with surgical precision. Prince Harry arrived expecting to control the conversation. He expected his trauma to be accepted without question. He expected his contradictions to go unexamined. He expected that a man who'd spent decades interviewing politicians and celebrities and public figures would somehow bow to the weight of a crown. Within 23 minutes, he discovered what millions had already learned. Howard Stern doesn't bow to anyone, especially not to men who think a title makes them untouchable. The cameras caught everything, every condescending smirk, every arrogant deflection, and the moment when Howard Stern, methodically and completely, dismantled not just Harry's narrative, but Harry's understanding of himself. The Howard Stern Show studio existed in a world of its own. Dim lighting, walls plastered with decades of outrageous moments, shocking interviews, and cultural artifacts from a career that had spanned nearly half a century. The unmistakable energy of a space where anything could happen and usually did. This was not a safe space for guests. This was not a place where narratives went unquestioned or contradictions went unexamined. This was the domain of a man who'd built his empire on one principle: authenticity, no matter how uncomfortable that authenticity became. Howard Stern sat behind his microphone, long hair tucked behind one ear, glasses reflecting the studio lights. He'd done this thousands of times. He could read people. He could sense when someone was about to lie, when someone was being evasive, when someone was performing rather than being honest. There was something about this particular guest, though, that made him lean back with a knowing smirk. "This is going to be interesting," he murmured to Robin Quivers, his co-host of 3 decades. The two had a rhythm that had been perfected over countless interviews. They could anticipate each other's moves, could sense when the other was about to push, when the other wanted to retreat. Robin raised an eyebrow knowingly. "You think he'll actually answer anything?" Howard's smile widened. "I think he'll try not to. That's when it gets fun." The door opened. Prince Harry stepped inside, and the moment was unmistakable. The way he entered suggested ownership. The way he moved through the space suggested he expected it to accommodate him, not the other way around. There was a stiffness to his posture, a rigidity that suggested he'd prepared himself for battle rather than conversation. He offered a brief nod to Howard and Robin before settling into the guest chair across from Howard's microphone setup. The chair where countless guests had sat before him, some famous, some infamous, all of them soon to be exposed to a level of questioning they hadn't anticipated. "Welcome to the show, Prince Harry," Howard began, his voice carrying that signature blend of warmth and mischief. It was disarming, that warmth. Guests often mistook it for softness. They didn't yet understand that Howard's kindness was contextual, that it disappeared the moment someone stopped being honest. "I got to ask," Howard continued, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man in his own domain. "Should we bow, salute, or just vibe? What's the protocol for interviewing someone who hates protocol?" It was a joke, an icebreaker, a way to establish that this was going to be a casual conversation, not a formal interrogation. Robin laughed softly, picking up on the playful energy. But Harry's response revealed something crucial about the mindset he'd brought to this room. "You don't need to bow," he said coldly. "I'm not part of that circus anymore." The temperature shifted, slightly, imperceptibly, but unmistakably. Howard's smile remained, but his eyes sharpened. He'd just been told, in the first 30 seconds of the interview, that he and his entire studio existed in a circus, that Harry had moved beyond it, that they were fundamentally lesser. "Well, you left the circus, sure," Howard replied, his voice remaining warm but with a new precision. "But the circus didn't leave you. That's why we're here, right?" Harry crossed his arms defensively. "I'm here because people need to hear the truth without tabloid twisting." Howard leaned back further, genuinely amused now. Buddy, you're on the Howard Stern show. Twisting isn't our brand. Asking blunt questions is. We're the opposite of tabloid. We're the place where celebrities come to say what they actually think, usually while horrifying their publicists. The air tightened slightly. Harry gave a smug half-smile, the kind of smile that suggested he was already several steps ahead of everyone in the room. That's fine, Harry said, his tone dripping with condescension. As long as the questions are intelligent. Robin winced visibly. She'd been doing this long enough to sense the incoming explosion. Howard kept the grin but lowered his voice, and when he spoke again, there was an undercurrent of something dangerous beneath the warmth. Trust me, he said quietly. The intelligent ones are usually the most uncomfortable. Harry sighed dramatically, as if he was already bored, already above this. Then let's get on with it. Howard opened with what he thought was a warm-up question, something designed to ease into the interview, to establish rapport before moving to deeper territory. So, how's life in America? You've been here a while now. California treating you well? It should have been simple, an easy opener. But Harry's response was defensive before Howard had even finished asking the question. It's tolerable, Harry said, shrugging with practiced indifference. Better than living in a palace where everyone pretends to care. Howard blinked. He'd interviewed thousands of people, and he could sense when someone was performing, when someone had their answers pre-rehearsed, when someone was reading from an internal script rather than actually engaging. Harry was doing all three. Tolerable, Howard repeated, his voice carrying something like amusement. Most people would kill to live in a Montecito mansion with ocean views. Harry shrugged again, his tone becoming more condescending with each word. When you've grown up surrounded by actual privilege, you stop being impressed by houses. The arrogance was staggering, not just present, but strutting. Howard had interviewed actual royalty before. He'd interviewed presidents and dictators and moguls. But there was something different about this kind of arrogance. The arrogance of someone who'd been told his whole life that he was special, and now that the world had rejected his narrative, he was doubling down on the belief rather than questioning it. Robin quietly whispered to the producer, "Oh, wow." Howard chuckled, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was the laugh of someone who'd just recognized the game and decided to play it with precision. "Okay, your highness of humility," he said. "Let's try again." Harry snapped slightly. "Is there a real question in there? Or do you just want to poke fun?" Howard leaned forward, not breaking eye contact, his expression shifting from amused to focused. "All right, real question. You left the royal family to escape the spotlight and then went on Oprah, Netflix, a book tour, podcast deals, and now my show. Isn't that a little contradictory?" It was a simple observation, not hostile, not aggressive, just a straightforward pointing out of a logical inconsistency. But Harry's jaw tightened visibly. The question had landed somewhere vulnerable. "It's not a contradiction," Harry defended, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "It's control. I share my story, not the press." Howard tapped his pen against the desk, a gesture that somehow conveyed both skepticism and genuine curiosity. "Sure, but you still want the spotlight. You're here. That says something." "It says I want the truth heard," Harry replied. "Not distorted." "But you're still in the narrative," Howard pressed. "Still the story. Still the headlines. The only thing that's changed is who's profiting from it." Harry's glare sharpened dangerously. The observation had exposed something he'd spent years avoiding, the reality that he hadn't escaped the spotlight. He'd simply repositioned himself within it. That his narrative wasn't about freedom. It was about control. And control, as Howard was beginning to demonstrate, was a different animal entirely. "I'm controlling my own narrative," Harry said, his voice becoming defensive. "That's different from being controlled," Howard replied calmly. "But you're still in the narrative, aren't you? Still the story. Still the headlines. The only thing that's changed is who's profiting from it." The repetition was intentional. Howard was establishing that this wasn't just a single observation. This was a pattern, a reality that Harry couldn't escape by simply reframing it. Howard shifted his approach slightly, moving from the general to the personal. Speaking of truth, are you happy? Genuinely happy. Harry's expression shifted to something almost defensive. It was such a simple question, the kind of question any friend would ask. But Harry heard it as a challenge. Of course I'm happy, he said. Why wouldn't I be? Howard studied him for a long moment. This was his gift. The ability to sit in silence and let guests fill it. Let them talk themselves into corners because they couldn't handle the weight of an unspoken question. I don't know, Howard said finally. You seem pretty tense for someone who's happy. You seem angry. I'm not tense, Harry insisted. I'm focused. Focused on what? Howard asked. On correcting false narratives. On building something meaningful. On proving that I made the right choice. The answer was revealing in its desperation. Harry was still fighting. Still trying to convince someone. Still measuring his life against an external metric rather than actually living it. Howard had heard this before. The language of someone who'd convinced themselves that their life was a narrative to be won rather than a reality to be lived. Proving to whom? Howard asked, and the question seemed to catch Harry off guard. To the people who doubted me. Howard smiled gently. See, that's interesting. Happy people usually don't spend their energy proving things to doubters. They just live their lives. Harry's face flushed slightly. I am living my life. Are you? Howard replied. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still fighting battles that ended years ago. The battles haven't ended, Harry said defensively. They've just changed form. Maybe, Howard agreed. Or maybe you're the one who won't let them end. The observation hung in the air. Howard had accomplished something significant. He'd gotten Harry to admit, through his own words, that he was the one perpetuating the conflict. That the battles had changed form, which meant the original battle had ended, which meant Harry was choosing to continue fighting something that technically didn't exist anymore. Robin murmured softly, "Oh, this is getting deep." Harry shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. This wasn't the interview he'd prepared for. These weren't the friendly questions he'd expected. This was something else, a conversation where his pre-prepared answers were being exposed as evasions. Can we talk about something else? He asked, trying to redirect. Howard nodded, as if he was being accommodating. Sure, let's talk about Meghan. The shift in Harry's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. A wall is going up so fast you could almost hear it slam. His expression closed off. His posture stiffened. The vulnerability that had briefly emerged disappeared entirely, replaced by cold defensiveness. What about her? He asked warily. Howard shrugged with casual curiosity. Everything. How's she doing? How's the marriage? People are curious. She's fine, Harry said tightly. She's wonderful. We're both thriving. There was that word again. Thriving. Howard had been listening to Harry and Meghan use that word for years, and every time it seemed less true. Every time, it sounded more like a mantra they were chanting to convince themselves rather than a description of reality. That word keeps coming up with you guys, Howard observed. Thriving. Because it's true, Harry replied defensively. Howard studied him for a moment. And she's happy. Really happy. Harry snapped. Why does everyone keep asking that? They expect a different answer. Yes, she's happy. I'm happy. We're happy. Is that so hard to believe? The question was revealing. If they were truly happy, why would people expect a different answer? Why would the question of happiness feel like an attack? Why would Harry feel the need to defend something that should have been self-evident? Howard held up his hands, his expression remaining open and curious. Hey, I'm just asking. You came on the show. Questions are kind of the deal. Questions are fine, Harry said. Insinuations aren't. What did I insinuate? Howard asked, genuinely curious. That we're not what we say we are. Howard shook his head slowly. I asked if you were happy. You got defensive. That's not an insinuation. That's an observation. I've noticed that distinction seems hard for you. Howard shifted territory again, moving to the family that Harry had spent years publicly attacking. All right, let's talk family. Your actual family. How are things with William? Harry rolled his eyes dramatically, as if the question itself was exhausting. Of course. That's all anyone wants to talk about. Well, yeah, Howard said simply. You wrote an entire book about it. I wrote a book about my life, Harry corrected. He happens to be part of it. A pretty significant part, Howard replied. You talked about him throwing things at you, physical altercations, deep resentments. Any progress on fixing that relationship? Harry's smirk returned, cold and condescending. Some relationships can't be fixed. Some people don't want to change. Howard leaned back, his expression shifting to something more serious. And you're sure it's all on him? Excuse me? Harry stiffened visibly. I'm asking if you've considered that maybe, just maybe, some of the problems involve you too. I've done nothing but try to repair things, Harry insisted. They're the ones who refuse. Howard's response was quiet but devastating. Have you? Because from the outside, it looks like you've spent 3 years publicly attacking them while claiming you want reconciliation. I've told my truth, Harry said defensively. Your truth involved sharing private family conversations, childhood traumas, and accusations that your family is racist, Howard replied. That's not a peace offering, Harry. That's a declaration of war. Harry's face flushed. They needed to be held accountable. And you're the one who gets to hold them accountable, Howard said. You who benefited from that system for 30+ years. You're the moral authority here. The sarcasm in his voice was sharp, but it was also precisely calibrated. Howard wasn't mocking Harry for the sake of it. He was pointing out a genuine contradiction. Harry had spent decades benefiting from an institution that he now claimed was fundamentally corrupt. He'd lived in palaces and accepted privileges and enjoyed every advantage that came with his position. And now, having left that institution, he'd appointed himself as its moral judge. Harry leaned forward aggressively. I'm the one who dared to leave. Howard nodded slowly, his expression remaining calm. Or the one who had somewhere better to go. Most people don't leave bad situations because they can't afford to. You left because you had a rich wife and Netflix money waiting for you. That's not courage. That's options. The studio fell silent. Harry stared at Howard, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a response. But no response didn't prove Howard's point further. Robin whispered to herself. Oh my God. Harry finally spoke, his voice shaking with controlled fury. You don't know anything about my choices. I know what you've told us, Howard replied calmly. And what you've told us is that you escaped an oppressive institution by moving into a $16 million mansion. Forgive me if the sympathy doesn't flow freely. Harry stood up slightly, then sat back down. A false start that betrayed his agitation. He wanted to leave, but something, perhaps the awareness that leaving would validate everything Howard was saying, kept him anchored to the chair. This is exactly what happens, Harry said, his voice tight. I try to share my perspective, and people like you twist it into something negative. Howard shook his head with the patient precision of someone who'd heard this complaint 1,000 times before. I haven't twisted anything. I've repeated your own words back to you and asked follow-up questions. If that feels like twisting, maybe the problem is the original shape. What's that supposed to mean? Harry demanded. It means your narrative has holes, Harry. Big ones. You can't simultaneously claim you want privacy while doing constant media appearances. You can't claim you want reconciliation while publicly attacking your family every 6 months. You can't claim you're thriving while looking this angry all the time. Harry's voice rose defensively. I'm not angry. You've been angry since you walked in, Howard replied calmly. I made a joke about bowing, and you bit my head off. You're the angriest, thriving person I've ever met. Harry's hands clenched. Maybe I'm angry because people like you refuse to understand. Or maybe, Howard said, his voice dropping to something even quieter. You're angry because people like me see through the act. Robin inhaled sharply. The tension in the studio had become almost palpable. This was no longer an interview. This was an interrogation. This was Howard Stern, methodically and systematically, dismantling the narrative that Harry had spent years constructing. Harry ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. He was losing control of the conversation. The performance was slipping. What remained underneath was rawer and more desperate. "You know what?" Harry said, his voice rising. "This is exactly what I expected. Another American host pretending they understand my life better than I do." Howard's response was quiet, more threatening than shouting could ever be. "I don't pretend to understand your life. I'm trying to understand you, but you're making it impossible because every question becomes an attack in your mind." Harry's lips curled in a cold, dismissive smile. "Maybe I'm not here to be understood." Howard tapped his pen against the desk. "Then why are you here?" Harry looked away, jaw clenched. "I'm here because my team thought it would be good for the book." The admission hung in the air. Harry had just admitted that he was here for a promotion. That this wasn't about sharing truth or connecting with people or having a real conversation. It was about selling a product. Howard leaned forward. "So you're here for promotion?" "I'm here to share my story," Harry said defensively. "Which you're also selling for money," Howard replied, "while claiming you don't care about money." "I never said I don't care about money," Harry snapped. "You've implied that you left royalty because it was morally compromised," Howard said, his logic inexorable. "But you've replaced royal money with corporate money. Netflix money, Spotify money, book deal money. How is that more ethical?" Harry sputtered, searching for a response that wouldn't prove Howard's point. "It's different because I'm in control." "You're in control of what exactly?" Howard asked. "You have deals with corporations that expect content. You have publishers that expect books. You have media appearances that expect headlines. You've traded one set of obligations for another. The only difference is you chose these ones." "Exactly," Harry said. "I chose them. So did King Charles choose his? So did William. They chose to stay. You chose to leave. Neither choice is morally superior. They're just different." Harry's voice rose dangerously. "My choice was about survival. Your choice was about preference," Howard replied calmly. "You preferred California over London. You preferred Netflix over palace duties. You preferred freedom from scrutiny while maintaining the benefits of celebrity. That's fine, but don't dress it up as some heroic escape." Harry slammed his palm on the arm of his chair. The gesture was violent, desperate, the movement of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were collapsing. "You have no idea what I sacrificed," he said, his voice shaking. Howard didn't flinch. His response was measured and devastating. "You sacrificed a life most people would kill for to live another life most people would kill for. Forgive me if I don't see the tragedy." "I sacrificed my family," Harry said, his voice breaking slightly. "You chose to leave your family," Howard corrected gently. "Those are different verbs. One suggests something was taken from you. The other suggests you made a choice. Which is it? Did you choose or were you forced? Because you keep switching depending on what makes you look better." Harry stared at Howard, breathing heavily. The words had landed somewhere deep. They'd exposed the central contradiction that Harry had been dancing around for years. The contradiction between claiming he was forced out and claiming he chose to leave. The contradiction between positioning himself as a victim and as an agent of his own destiny. He couldn't be both simultaneously. One undermined the other. "You're deliberately misunderstanding me," he said finally. "I'm deliberately listening to you," Howard replied. "And what I hear is someone who can't keep his story straight because the truth is messier than the narrative he's selling." Robin murmured. "This is brutal." Harry stood up suddenly, the movement abrupt and aggressive. "I don't have to sit here and be psychoanalyzed." Howard stood too, not aggressively, but with the firm authority of someone reclaiming his space. "You're right. You don't. You can leave any time. Maybe you should." Harry's voice dropped to something cold. "Maybe I will. Because honestly, Harry," Howard continued, his tone shifting to something almost sad, "I'm not sure what you came here to accomplish. You won't answer questions about Meghan. You won't discuss your family without getting defensive. You won't engage with any perspective that doesn't match your own. What exactly did you think was going to happen? Harry's voice turned icy. I thought I'd get a fair interview. This is fair, Howard replied. Fair doesn't mean agreeable. Fair means I ask real questions and you give real answers. You've given me deflection, hostility, and rehearsed talking points. That's not a conversation. That's a performance. Harry laughed bitterly. That's rich coming from a shock jock who's made a career out of being outrageous. Howard's response was quiet and devastating. I've made a career out of being honest. There's a difference. And I've been honest with you tonight, more honest than most people in your life probably are. The question is whether you can handle it. I can handle anything, Harry said defensively. Except questions. Except pushback, Howard corrected. Except anyone who doesn't tell you what you want to hear. Harry ripped off his microphone, the gesture sharp and angry. The wire came free with a snap. This was a mistake. Coming here was a mistake. Howard nodded. Maybe, but not for the reasons you think. Harry paused at the edge of leaving, caught despite himself. What's that supposed to mean? It means you came here thinking you'd control the conversation, Howard said, his voice remaining calm and clear. You came here thinking your title and your trauma would shield you from scrutiny. And when they didn't, you fell apart. That's not my fault, Harry. That's yours. I didn't fall apart, Harry insisted. But he was standing up, ripping off equipment, preparing to storm out. The physical actions contradicted the words entirely. You're standing up, ripping off equipment, and preparing to leave because I asked you questions, Howard observed. What would you call that? Harry's face contorted with barely suppressed rage. I call it refusing to be disrespected. And I call it fragility, Howard replied. The inability to handle anything that doesn't go exactly your way. Harry pointed at Howard, his hand shaking with rage and something else. Something closer to desperation. You're going to regret this. Howard smiled thinly. Threats now? That's very royal of you. It's not a threat, Harry said. It's a promise. People will see how I was treated here. They'll see exactly what happened. Yes, they will, Howard agreed. A journalist asking questions. A prince refusing to answer them. A confrontation that the guest created and then fled from. I'm not fleeing, Harry said. But he was moving toward the door, drawn back by the observation. You're literally walking toward the door, Howard pointed out calmly. Harry stopped, caught in the observation. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Embarrassment, maybe, or the uncomfortable awareness that he'd lost control of the situation entirely. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by coldness. This show is beneath me anyway, Harry said with venom. You're all beneath me. The studio went absolutely silent. Robin covered her mouth. The crew exchanged shocked glances. In that single moment, Harry had revealed what had been driving this entire interview. The core belief that had poisoned everything. The fundamental conviction that he was better than everyone in the room. Howard nodded slowly, deliberately. There it is, finally. The truth you've been hiding all this time. Harry blinked. What? You think you're better than everyone? Howard said, his voice carrying something like sadness. Better than me. Better than the audience. Better than the people who bought your book and watched your documentary and gave you platform after platform to tell your story. You think your title makes you special even though you claim you don't want it anymore. I never said, Harry began. You just said it, Howard interrupted. Out loud on the microphone. You said we're beneath you. Those are your words. You said them because you finally got frustrated enough to drop the act. That's not what I meant, Harry protested weakly. That's exactly what you meant, Howard replied. And here's the thing, Harry. You're not above anyone in this room. You're not above the crew who set up these lights. You're not above Robin, who's listened to you condescend to us for 20 minutes. You're not above the audience who took time out of their day to watch this interview. Howard stepped closer, and when he spoke again, His voice had dropped to something quiet and devastatingly personal. You're not above any of them, and pretending you are is why you've lost everyone who ever mattered to you. Your family, your country, your credibility. You've traded all of it for the right to feel superior. And now you're standing in my studio, insulting everyone around you and wondering why people don't love you anymore. Harry stood frozen. The arrogance had cracked completely. Underneath it was something raw and vulnerable. Pain. Confusion. The look of a man who'd just heard something he couldn't unhear. But he couldn't admit it. Not here. Not now. Not in front of cameras. You're wrong about me, Harry whispered. Howard shook his head. Maybe, but I don't think so. And neither does anyone watching. Harry turned and walked toward the exit. But at the door he paused. His hand on the frame, he turned back one final time. You'll regret this, he said, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded almost hollow, as if he was reciting a line from a script that no longer fit. I doubt it, Howard replied. But I think you might. Goodbye, Harry. The door slammed behind him. Not with the force of anger, but with the finality of something closing for the last time. The studio sat in stunned silence for a long moment. The crew exchanged shocked glances. Robin stared at the empty guest chair. Howard remained seated at his microphone, processing what had just happened. Well, he said finally, that happened. Robin shook her head slowly. I've never seen anything like that. Howard rubbed his temples. He looked tired, not from the interview itself but from the weight of what it had revealed. I didn't want it to go that way. I really didn't. But he came in swinging. And when you swing at me in my own house, I swing back. He called us beneath him, Robin said softly. He did, Howard agreed. And that's the part that'll stick. Not the questions. Not the deflections. That moment when he finally said what he actually thinks. Robin looked at Howard with an expression that mixed concern with something else. Perhaps respect for the way he'd handled an impossible situation. Do you feel bad? Howard considered the question seriously, taking his time before responding. I feel sad, he said finally. Not for me. For him. He's clearly lost, clearly angry, clearly convinced that the whole world is against him. And when you believe that, you make it true. You push everyone away and then blame them for leaving. He turned to face the camera, his expression serious and thoughtful. Folks, I want to say something, he began, and his voice carried a different quality now. Not the harsh interrogator's voice, but something closer to genuine sadness. That was supposed to be a conversation about his book, his life, his perspective. What it became was something else entirely. He's welcome to tell his side of things anywhere he wants. He's welcome to clarify what he meant or defend his choices or explain himself to audiences that might be more receptive. Howard paused. But he's not welcome back here. Not after that. And I say that not with anger, but with understanding. Because what we witnessed today wasn't just an interview going wrong. It was someone's defenses that completely failed them. It was someone's carefully constructed narrative collapsing under basic scrutiny. And rather than adapting, rather than engaging, he chose to attack and then leave. That's his right. But it's also his choice. And that choice has consequences. The interview lasted 23 minutes. Its impact would last considerably longer. For Howard Stern, it was confirmation of something he'd always known about his craft. That honesty, even when delivered harshly, has a power that flattery can never achieve. That truth-telling, when done with precision and care, can expose things that people spend years trying to hide from themselves. For Prince Harry, somewhere in California, the interview would become something he couldn't escape. Not because of how he was treated, but because of what he'd revealed. Not because of Howard's questions, but because of his own answers. The moment when the arrogance had cracked. The moment when he'd revealed his true belief that he was better than everyone around him. That belief, Howard had suggested, was the problem. Not the circumstances of his life. Not the treatment he'd received. Not the family conflicts or the media scrutiny or any of the external factors that Harry had spent years blaming. The problem was the belief that he was superior to everyone trying to understand him. The belief that his title mattered. The belief that he was special in a way that exempted him from the basic courtesy of honesty. Some kingdoms are inherited, others are built. Only one of those men had truly earned a throne that commanded respect. Not because of how he treated people when they agreed with him, but how he treated them when they challenged him. Not because of the titles he possessed, but because of the character he demonstrated when those titles were stripped away. Howard Stern had built his kingdom through decades of honesty, even when that honesty made people uncomfortable. Prince Harry had inherited his kingdom and then spent years defending it as if it still belonged to him. When it was finally taken away, not by external force but by his own choices, he discovered that without it, there was nothing underneath but arrogance and fear. That was the real story. Not the interview, not the walk-off, not the moment when Harry had called them all beneath him. The real story was what came after that revelation. The hollow threat, the exit without dignity, the awareness that he'd revealed something he couldn't take back, that no amount of friendly media appearances or controlled messaging could erase. Howard Stern doesn't bow to anyone. He'd proven that once again. But more importantly, he'd revealed to millions of viewers that some people expect the world to bow to them, not because they've earned that respect, but because they've convinced themselves they deserve it. And when the world refuses, they don't adapt. They don't grow. They just get angrier, more defensive, more convinced that everyone around them is the problem. That was the lesson. That was what would stick. Not the questions, but the answers. Not what Howard said, but what Harry revealed about himself.